Alright, it's Tuesday. We are in week 5 already. And this is day 9. This is NET-136. Operating Systems 2, we did a little review. Chapters 1 through 6. CLL commands, basically what the students did. We have a practice sheet that they were working on. We have we've got a unit test coming up over chapters 1 through 6, and that'll be open notes. Reviewed a little bit about process, threads, synchronization, then we talked about scheduling, we talked about real-time scheduling. This idea of how do you prioritize what processes in the computer get the start, time, then release time, or sometimes referred to as start time. So we talked about how important deadline is. Some deadlines are hard, more or less when the process starts. It's a certain amount of time, then it has to finish. Some are soft. And in a lot of cases we need what we would call real-time operating systems. For example, we gave the airbags. When a car, when a car has a crash, those airbags have to be deployed, and the system has to run from beginning to end. You can't start it and then preempt it and do something else and then come back to it. There's a lot of situations where a hard stop, a hard deadline has to be enforced. So once a process has to process to its entirety, it has to go until it's done, reach that deadline. Some things we talk about more like soft. Example, the materials from PK.org gave was like video. Those video frames have to be, let's say, decompressed. So it comes in compressed, has to be decompressed. So when that starts, it has to finish. You can't have it part way done. But it's not as critical of a situation, so we call that a soft deadline. We need it, but it's not safety critical that it gets done. Okay. Then, this week, in the course, we talked about general things in the course. We should finish up exams 1 through 6. Labs 1 through 3 we did in class, and these labs are on their own. And they should be done up through files and directories. Files and directories, that's up through 6. So this week, that should all be completed. A brief review of Linux. We talked about a little bit of the history of Unix. I mentioned I was working on Unix back in the early 80s. Then we have Linux. Was developed, I don't remember the exact year, but we spent some time talking about open source. I reviewed that idea. Humans write code, and code is compiled, and when that code is available, open source. Mentioned briefly distributions, a couple main ones, Red Hat and Debian. Fedora, what we're using, CentOS, Ubuntu, those might sound familiar, but they fit under these main distributions. Then we spent a little bit of time talking about release cycles. How often, does the software get released? We gave the example Fedora last spring we used Fedora 25. This spring we're using Fedora 27. Okay, release cycles, when there's a lot, you might think that's advantageous because everything is up to date. Well, that's fine, but in some cases businesses would like release cycles to be a bigger time span, so that once they start on one, they know that's going to stay pretty consistent until this point. You know, a lot of business would look at 2 to 3 years. Alright, so when there's major releases, and there's always concern about whether you update or not. How we use Linux. Service web pages, web servers, we did an example of that. Mail server, we're going to look at that early on next week. File servers, people, storage, you can believe that. Databases, for example, we're using MySQL in the database class. Then we talked about running Windows with a graphical view, running X Windows. That's the base graphical system, and then from that there's systems that run different GUIs that connect to that. For example, we use GNOME. Alright. There is a lot of information about the Free Software Foundation, and they talk about the different licensing of Linux and open source. I think it's really good to understand that. We talked about it just a little bit in class. And then we did talk also about Creative Commons, this whole idea of having a commons, and different types of licensing here for your work. A lot of times this work is free for distribution as long as you follow some particular rules. So there's different levels of that. We'll look at that. I think I actually look at that a little more later on in the class. Command line basics. Understand we have the bash shell. We do a little review here. So we have hardware. And then talking to the hardware. Let me see if I can draw that a little better. This is the operating system. Meaning the hardware. Then you might think of as this layer here, which is the shell. And we have a user communicates with the shell. And then we can communicate with the shell with a command line interface, or we can have a GUI. And then the user communicates with the GUI. GUI talks to the shell, to the OS. The OS talks to the hardware. Command line. One of the advantages of command line is being able to write scripts, bash scripting. It's like coding. We can have a group of commands and tell it to execute those commands. So as we're learning the commands here, we need to think about we can put them in scripts. We talked a little bit about a couple key variables, the history variable. The other day we did some work with the path variable and took a look at those. Help. Help. Manual pages. There is a lot of information in a man page. So this chapter talked about some of the ways to use those resources. Okay. Just a little note here about aliases and being able to store those. And a couple things up. Using Linux. command line, we talked about that. Help. Files and directories. One of the things I say we need to get used to is being able to move through the hierarchy. You know, one simple one like change directory, and then all those different facets of changing directories. Being able to understand the whole system. We looked at the other day, we have the root of the system, and not a lot of directories coming off of that, but boy are there a lot of directories coming off of those and files. So we talked about the home directory, where the users are. We talked about paths. Understand what paths are in terms of the current directory. You know which one you're currently in. Being to understand where you are. PWD, we talked about that command. A couple key words. Absolute path or a relative path. Absolute come from the top of the hierarchy and work your way down into some directory. A relative path, you work your way down from wherever you're at. So then we looked at a few commands. Let me change this here. Listing files. We have ls, and then we have the alias. Long listing. We talked about how we can copy files, move files, create files, make directories, and be able to manage files and directories. Alright, well, that pretty much takes care of chapters 1 through 6, and a lot of command line information. And that is it.